You're tuned into Radio Pacific.
Almost half of the people who came in with PTSD and did MDMA therapy at the VA were cured?
Yes.
Lykos Therapeutics announcing today it is laying off 75% of its workforce. This coming
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is voicing support for psychedelic drugs to treat certain conditions like depression.
Of all the new research being done on psychedelic therapies, the furthest developed is MDMA-assisted therapy. The therapy also has fascinating roots in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's August 2025, I'm Eli Cohen, and this month on Radio Pacific, we talk MDMA and the Bay, the drug's underground past and auspicious future. Welcome to Radio Pacific, I'm Eli Cohen. This month, we've got something a little different for you. The topic is MDMA-assisted therapy, its past and present, so much of which has happened right here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We also experimented with the format, taping this episode in front of a live audience at 220 Montgomery Street, KALW's live studio space in downtown San Francisco. Yeah, so without further ado, please enjoy MDMA and the Bay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. This is the first live taping of Radio Pacific, which is very, very exciting. Tonight's event is called MDMA and the Bay, featuring an absolutely star-studded panel, which I am sure many of you already know, to discuss the history of this misunderstood drug and its really distinct history right here in the Bay Area. But before we get to our panel, I want to play a little clip that kind of demonstrates what we try to do each episode on Radio Pacific. So what you're going to hear, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, is over the weekend, I interviewed a woman named Lori Tipton. Lori was a participant in the Phase 2 trial for MDMA-assisted therapy, I believe back around 2017. And she's a writer and author living in New Orleans. And I don't want to give away too much, but basically I sat down with her and asked her to really explain in vivid detail what one of these sessions is actually like. When you take the drug, you're there with your therapists, and you have the experience together. So we're going to play a little bit of that. Fair warning, this is a treatment for PTSD, so it is pretty intense. We don't dwell, but murder, suicide, it's all in there. So just keep that in mind. And there will be subtitles because it can be a little bit hard to hear. But if you want, I'd invite you to actually close your eyes because that is how Lori herself experienced much of these sessions. So, yeah.
My name is Lori Tipton. I am a writer in New Orleans, Louisiana. I just like to state, this was my protocol as part of this study. Okay, so I arrive, I get dropped off by my partner. I have a bag to spend the night. I got my stuffed owl pillow. I got my foam roller. I'm nervous. I'd had some black coffee. Probably not the best choice when you have an anxiety problem. Don't start your morning with nothing but black coffee. That's a free tip for everybody listening. Sorry. This is a serious story because it's very sad in parts. Okay. So I arrive and I get there. The two doctors, I'd had several sessions at this point, right? So you don't just jump in. It's not like, Craigslist. You find a doctor, they give you drugs and heal you. I wish it was that simple. It's just not. I was presented with 2 capsules. They were each 40 milligrams of MDMA. I knew ahead of time as part of the study that I was in, I was definitely getting MDMA, so it wasn't a double blind. And I was going to be offered 90 minutes in a supplementary dose. So I could take either 80 or 120 milligrams of MDMA. And being a New Orleanian, I was 100% sure I was going to take 120. Because I'm I'm here. And so I take the drug. I put the eye mask on. I put the earphones on. And it's weird. Straight up, it's weird. I'm laying there at first and I'm trying to do the thing that I, paid thousands of dollars to become a yoga teacher to do, which is meditate. And I'm trying to like let my thoughts float past me. And it's just really hard for me. And then I'm just like, okay, just focus on your breathing. And it's not working. And I'm laying there and I'm just like, when you're traumatized, maybe when you're not traumatized, but when you're traumatized, it's like sometimes your brain just spirals. You're in overtime. And specifically for me, the way my trauma manifested, like I said earlier, hypervigilant. And so very hard to concentrate without my mind spiraling out, projecting every bad scenario that could possibly happen. What am I doing? What's happening? Am I doing this right? Like, I just took this fucking drug. I'm laying here. Like, am I, like, when's it gonna start? What's gonna happen when it hits me? Am I gonna, like, flip my shit? Like, I'm on a roller coaster in the dark. I'm probably gonna fuck this up. It's gonna be terrible. Something bad is gonna happen. And then I start to feel something. And it's like this kind of buzzy feeling in my body, but it's not uncomfortable or scary. Do you know, like, the comfort of lying in warm sand? Your muscles just relax. Does that make sense? Like, it's like your body just kind of relaxes a little bit and you just feel like, oh, okay, this feels different. Like, it's not jarring. It's not like, oh my God, I'm so fucked up, what's happening? It's just like, oh, like my physical body feels different. Like a soul exhale. Which is, I think, myself, being a traumatized person, I have spent so much time in my head. So feeling anything viscerally of my body was so foreign to me. It was like, oh, I can feel my body and it feels good. And I'm like, I should tell them about this. And just this memory just pops up. All of a sudden, I was there, and I was with my brother Davin, and we were young, and we were out in El Paso, Texas. And I just remember that was the first time that we'd ever seen snow. And it was just the two of us in our little snowsuit mitteny things outside making these snowballs. And it felt so visceral and real. It was like the elation and joy that I felt as a child the first time I played in the snow. I don't know why it came to me, but it came to me and it was just so heartbreaking, but also at the same time so heartwarming to be like, oh, this thing happened and it exists in me and I can revisit it anytime I want to. And it's okay to be in this pain and it's okay to think about my brother. I know that he's no longer here, but I still have these memories and I still have this connection. It was in the third session when I really was like, I want to tell this story of this day when I walked into my mother's house. My mother murdered two women who were the other two most important women in my life. And she murdered herself. And I was the one that found all their bodies in her home. There were just parts of that memory that were completely missing from my mind. I tried for a decade to fill in these blanks in my mind, and it was like I would have nightmares about these things. I was tortured by it. As I was telling the story, I felt like I was there, which I hadn't felt the day that I had been there. And it was just such an overcoming feeling of terror. But at the same time, it was like, okay, well, I'm here and I'm safe. My eyes are closed and I'm sitting up and I'm just telling them, I'm like, this is where I was. This is when I drove up to the house. This is what I was wearing. This is what the fucking temperature felt like outside. This is what the house smelled like. This is how many cigarettes were in the ashtray when I walked in. I could remember all these things because it was like I was finally in the memory in a way that I had never accessed before. And that has never happened to me in, decade plus of therapy of trying to fucking like work on this. And I was able to be like, oh my God, this poor fucking girl. Like, she doesn't know what she's about to see. She doesn't know that this is a moment where she will never be the same ever again in a split second. And it was just holding all of that. And I just had like this heartbreaking amount of love for myself that I have never felt. Like, I've never loved myself like that. And so we come towards the end of the 8 hours. It's like you can feel the drug abating from your system. And it's not harsh, it's not terrible, but you're also exhausted. I mean, like, it's a lot of fucking work, right? And then I get home, and the next day, I get up, and I'm taking a shower, and I hear birds outside the window. And I come out of the shower, and I tell my partner, I'm like, oh, there must be like a new nest of birds outside the window because you can hear them when you're showering. It's so beautiful. And Andy's just like, those birds have been there forever.
That's the amazing Lori Tipton. Panelists, should we get this show on the road?
Let's do it.
Okay. So to introduce the panelists tonight, we've got three wonderful guests. I'll start here. Ooh, hello. Rachel Newer is an award-winning science journalist and author of a 2023 book, I Feel Love, which documents the full history of MDMA from the German patent application a century ago to the research, advocacy, and policy making being done today. You can buy a copy in the back after the event. Dr. Alia Lilienstein was formerly the lead physician for Lykos Therapeutics, which conducted the phase 3 clinical trials and the new drug application to the FDA for MDMA-assisted therapy to treat PTSD that happened last year, which we will discuss in detail. And Dr. Gul Dolan is a neuroscientist at UC Berkeley's Center for the Science of Psychedelics, working primarily with mice and octopuses. Gul's research with MDMA and critical periods of brain development is changing the field. Please welcome our three guests. So I'd like to start by just defining what we're talking about without getting into too much specific research quite yet. Gul, can you just tell us what exactly is MDMA?
Okay. I thought you were going to ask me a critical period. Yeah, okay. So MDMA is a psychedelic drug. Some people don't consider it a psychedelic drug, but I am one of the people who uses a broad umbrella definition of psychedelic that includes things like MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, ibogaine, ketamine, all as psychedelics. And this definition, for decades has been sort of accepted in the field. There's been, with more mechanistic studies, people trying to subdivide them. But Alexander Shulgin, who we saw the picture of, he made something, synthesized 220 psychedelic drugs that he tested on himself, and he considered MDMA a psychedelic, and I consider that good enough for me.
Can you say a little bit more about the chemical properties, what it's derived from, and why some people don't consider it a traditional psychedelic?
Yeah, so it is a methamphetamine derivative, and it has some overlapping properties with the amphetamine classes. It's sort of stimulating. It has a unique acute subjective effect, which we call prosocial. Other people call it empathogenic, meaning it produces feelings of empathy. Some people call it entactogenic, for touching within. But basically, this is unusual amongst other psychedelics, which can be characterized as sort of hallucinogenic. So this is what people think of when they think of psychedelics, typically like LSD and magic mushrooms. But other psychedelics, like ketamine and PCP are dissociative psychedelics, so they're different from MDMA as well. And then sort of another category is the onirogenic, so they induce a dreamlike state, and that's psychedelics like ibogaine and Salvinorin A. And so MDMA is there are only a few examples of this prosocial empathogenic type of psychedelic.
Amazing, thank you. So when I first started looking into all of this, I live over in Berkeley, and I was led to believe that MDMA was actually created here in the East Bay Hills. But Rachel, your book showed me that's not quite right. Can you give us the full history?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to say I agree with Gul and with Sasha Shulgin. MDMA is a psychedelic. So the story of MDMA begins on Christmas Eve, 1912, when the German pharmaceutical company Merck filed a patent for MDMA. And they weren't looking for a mind-altering substance. They were trying to get a blood clotting agent, and MDMA was just a chemical intermediary on that stepwise process. Now, we don't know whether or not Merck's scientists discovered MDMA's special properties. There's some hints that they do, but they're very cagey about their archives. The next time MDMA pops up in the historical record is in the 1950s, when the US CIA and Army were doing very terrible experiments on people to try to find chemical agents that would allow them to control people's minds, to find a truth serum. And again, with the U.S. Army records, there isn't a sort of, there isn't definitive proof that they ever gave MDMA to a human subject. We know that they tested it in animals. We know that they tested similar drugs, MDA, for example, on humans, disastrously so. They caused a death unintentionally by overdosing a poor guy. But yeah, we don't know whether or not they actually tested MDMA. What we do know is that MDMA began popping up here and there, random places like a lab in Tennessee, a place in Indiana, with drug enforcement busts. And the drug enforcers, the DEA, were looking for MDA, this related compound. But it seems like because MDA had just been scheduled in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act, that smart chemists were trying to get around that through this technicality by just sticking another methyl group on there and creating MDMA. And that brings us finally to the Bay Area. In 1975, is the first occurrence of people taking MDMA who we know by name. And that was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley named Karl Resnikoff. And he was working with Sasha Shulgin, this chemist we keep talking about. And as a summer project, Karl decided he wanted to synthesize MDMA. And Shulgin, at the end of this synthesis, was like, well, here, why don't you just take some home and try it? So Karl and his girlfriend, Judith Gips, wound up taking MDMA on the ferry to Sausalito on a lovely September afternoon, and they had a fantastic time. Yeah.
I really love that story and find it inspirational in multiple ways. I want to dig in on this a little bit because I truly find it hard to believe that there are no recorded instances of humans taking this drug. I know in your book you talk a little bit about there's a lot of truth seekers out there trying to find that inaugural role, if you will. But I'm also wondering if we're focusing here on the Bay, what if no one had ever tried it? What instigated that moment with Shulgin and Resnikoff?
Yeah, so Karl was a drug aficionado. He had grown up in the Bay Area and wanted to synthesize LSD when he was something like, you read the book more recently, like 8 years old, 12 years old. It's like a precocious little boy. But he couldn't quite get that down, but he went to school with this interest in drugs, and that is why when he discovered that his a professor at UC Berkeley was Alexander Shulgin, who had prolifically published on psychedelic drugs, he just couldn't believe his luck, and he sought out Shulgin. So one of his favorite drugs was MDA, and he, because of his knowledge of chemistry, thought that if he stuck this methyl group on it, then it could be a more euphoric experience, and he thought correctly.
Gotcha. So I guess this is for any of the panelists. Could you tell us a little bit more about this somewhat mythic figure, Sasha Shulgin, and the Shulgin lab, the farm, where so much of this history occurred?
You knew him.
I met him. I mean, we weren't like besties, but yeah, I met him in 2005. He came to MIT where I was doing my PhD, and this is a great story. You know, that it was an opening ceremony for a new building, and everybody had invited, you know, famous people, mostly Nobel laureates. So it was like 6 Nobel laureates and Sasha. And the Nobel laureates were just kind of talking nonsense, you know, saying all kinds of stuff that most of the neuroscientists in the room were like, come on, that's not true. And then Sasha got up there, and he was completely lucid. They're all about the same age. And Sasha's like, oh, and then we moved the methyl group here, and we did this thing here, and this is how it changed, you know, the brain and consciousness. And all of the neuroscientists in the room were just like, oh, so cool. So that was the first time that I met him and Anne. His wife, Anne, was also a therapist using MDMA to assist in her therapy sessions. And yeah, Sasha was at Dow Chemicals for many years, and then they closed down their psychedelics department, and he decided to move his lab to his home in Lafayette, California, and had his lab back there. And
absolutely. Well, and I to put a fine point on it, their drug discovery process was anything but conventional. Rachel, could you talk a little bit about how they would run things?
Yeah, for sure. Well, as Gul alluded to earlier, they would actually take the drugs that Sasha synthesized themselves. So, and this harkens back to a tradition of scientists of yesterday or yore, trying drugs on themselves. And that faded away in the 20th century, but Sasha kept that tradition alive. And he would start with a small amount of the molecule he'd synthesized, and then if it produced favorable or no results, he would move up in doses. And if it was really interesting, then he would share it with Anne and also with a group of trusted friends. And they would all get together and take these novel drugs and, you know, take notes and report back to each other at the end of the trip on how it went, which is, yeah, it just doesn't really happen like that much anymore. But in terms of MDMA, when he first took this drug, and he took it about a year after Carl took it, and we don't know why that delay occurred, because Sasha had passed away by the time I did my book, and I don't know that anyone ever really asked him. But the word that immediately popped into his head was window. He felt like it was sort of a window on the soul. He could have this clarity of thought, of feeling that is lacking in sober life, something that Lori talked a little bit about. And because of this unique property of MDMA, he thought, I know exactly who I should introduce this to.
Leo Zeff.
Leo Zeff.
Yeah, please say more.
Okay, so Leo Zeff was this excellent psychedelic chemist in the Bay Area, and Leo Zeff had been part of the program in the 50s where therapists were using LSD to do therapy, and then all of that came crashing down with this complete turnaround with the war on drugs and with the criminalization in 1970 of LSD and other substances, including MDA, which is another molecule Leo was working with. So Leo was actually packing up his office and was retiring when he gets a call from his good buddy, Sasha Shulgin. And Sasha says, oh, hey, Leo, like, I need you to try this new substance. You're going to really like it. It's going to, do great things. And Leo's like, no, I'm retiring. That's not for me. And Sasha's like, well, okay, I'm just going to leave you some, and, you do with it what you will. And then a few days later, Sasha's phone rings, and it's Leo, and he's like, okay, I'm not retiring. I have work to do. So Leo had tried this molecule and also recognized, as Sasha had, its unique properties to open people up and just to open that window. And Leo became something of a Johnny Appleseed of MDMA. In terms of the therapeutic use, he spread it to his therapist colleagues and taught a lot of people around the U.S. and beyond about using MDMA, and he plugged into that framework that had been developed in the 1950s around LSD and MDA and some other molecules. But Leo and all these other therapists knew that if word got out about this new molecule, the DEA would certainly just write it off and schedule it, and it would be off the table. So they knew that they had to keep this under wraps and try to keep it a little hush-hush.
Right, but it's not technically illegal. What is this legal gray zone?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't illegal. It's because it wasn't scheduled. So the thing is, the DEA was just so rabidly just after all of these drugs that had any psychoactive effects that they would just put them on the list, no questions asked. And they were correct in suspecting that that is indeed how the agency would react. And the issue that came to a head around, well, in 1985 was that MDMA, as people say, it escaped from the therapist's couch and onto the dance floor. You know, it's a drug that under the right context makes you feel good, and people are going to want to do a drug that makes them feel good, and people figured that out, and some smart, dealers started selling it recreationally and pushing it in places like San Francisco, New York City, and even Dallas, Texas was a real mecca for MDMA use.
I'd like to talk a little bit about this scheduling hearing and the groups that organized in the lead up to it to try to stop it from happening, because I think it's actually in some ways an interesting prologue to things that are happening today. So for whoever would like to discuss, I guess the question is, how did this community learn that scheduling was happening, and then what did they decide to do in response?
Yeah.
And what was the ultimate decision?
Yeah, the DEA was moving to put MDMA on emergency scheduling 1 because they thought it was such a plague on the community. All these people were taking, as they called it, this kiddie drug out at clubs. So MDMA was placed on emergency scheduling, and surprisingly enough to the DEA, instead of just kind of shooing it through, all of these scientists and therapists, including Alexander Shulgin, wrote in a petition and said, no, it should not be placed on Schedule 1 because that's defined as substances with no known medical use and a high potential for abuse. And they clearly had evidence that it had a medical use. So they were arguing that it should be on a lower schedule, Schedule 3, for example, where they could still use it and study it, but it would be a controlled substance. So Alexander Shulgin and others, including scientists from Harvard, put together this petition to take the DEA to court to argue this case.
Was this something that was done frequently?
No, like the DEA was completely caught off guard. They're like, what? For my book, I actually interviewed the lead DEA researcher who brought this case to court, and he was like, we were like, what is going on here? And part of this case, Shulgin knew that he needed some young recruits to kind of push this forward. So he recruited a woman named Debbie Harlow, who unfortunately got COVID, so she couldn't make it tonight. She's just such a fascinating person. And Debbie recruited a young man named Rick Doblin, who I'm sure we're going to talk about in a bit. And so Debbie, Rick, and another friend of theirs kind of led up this case and organized it. And thanks to their hard work and to the testimonies of all these really respected scientists and therapists, they actually won the case. The judge sided with them and said, yeah, you're right. MDMA does have medical use and it shouldn't be scheduled. And he even made a comment like, I don't want us to look back in 50 years and see this time as like the dark ages when we, wrote off this very helpful molecule. But for bureaucratic reasons that I don't really understand, I'm not a political reporter, this judge's judgment was actually just a suggestion. So the DEA didn't have to follow his suggestion. And so they said, you know what? No thanks. We're going to do what we wanted to do the whole time and place it on Schedule 1, which is where it has been ever since.
Hey, Eli in the studio here. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, Gul, Aaliyah, and Rachel tell us about the psychedelics renaissance today and the latest groundbreaking research and clinical trials being done with MDMA. Stick around. Hey, it's still me, Eli. Just wanted to let you know that Radio Pacific is fully independent local media based right here in the Bay Area. If you like what you're hearing, the biggest way you can support us is to send this episode to a few friends
and to subscribe to and rate this podcast feed. Seriously, those two things make a huge difference. So thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the show.
Welcome back to Radio Pacific. If you're just joining us, today's episode is a taping from our first live show, MDMA and the Bay. We're in the middle of our panel with neuroscientist Gul Dolan, clinician Aaliyah Lilienstein, and author Rachel Newer. We pick up with Aaliyah telling us about the formation of MAPS, the group that has fought to bring MDMA therapy mainstream ever since the drug was banned in 1985.
So MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Rick chose a very clear name of what they were trying to do. And that was founded in 1986, after the scheduling of MDMA. And here we are today, and as Rachel said, it is still Schedule 1. But the goal of Rick's organization that he founded, a nonprofit, MAPS, was to study MDMA as you would any other drug in the regulatory process to demonstrate its safety and efficacy so that it could move from Schedule 1 to another schedule, potentially if it were FDA approved. It took a while to get that research going, though. They were able to do animal studies initially, but human trials didn't happen until the 2000s.
Gotcha. And yeah, I guess that does bring us more up into the contemporary time. I'm curious, this so-called psychedelic renaissance in the mainstream is maybe a little bit newer, but prior to that, there were researchers who were starting to take more of an interest in these compounds and do this research. I'm wondering, in your minds, what are some of those important studies where folks really started paying attention again?
In the early 2000s is when MAPS started to be able to do human trials, and we're able to use literature to skip a lot of the phase 1 studies and go straight to phase 2 studies. So that means moving from studying it in healthy volunteers where you're just trying to assess safety and dosing straight to treating populations of people who have an indication that you think it might be beneficial for. And so they're very, very small studies that to help a little bit with dosing, but they modeled these studies after what had been happening prior to the scheduling and underground work as well.
And then Gul, on a neuroscience level, when did you start researching these compounds?
In 2014, when I started my own lab at Johns Hopkins, I knew we were going to be working on MDMA, applied for the licenses. We started working on it mostly in mice, and it's a little bit of a convoluted story of how we got to octopuses, but we were working on them in mice, and the reason that we started with MDMA is because with all the other psychedelics, it's really hard to know what a mouse seeing God looks like, right? Like, it's just not easy to quantify. Whereas MDMA's unique prosocial properties meant that, we had assays to tell how much an animal likes being in a social environment versus not. We have assays of how much they can learn from their social environment versus not. And so we were doing those anyway, and we thought, well, I wonder what will happen on MDMA.
How can you tell when a mouse is on MDMA?
The assay that people had been using is called the 3-chambered social approach task. And it's essentially like, imagine a tank, and it has 3 compartments. One side has another mouse in it. Another side has a little toy object, and the middle is empty. And then you just put the mouse in, and you just record how much time they spend in each of the chambers. The assay that we were using was something a little bit different. So we were in the process of discovering something called a novel. It was a critical period. So these are windows of time that the brain is extremely sensitive to its environment and can form long-lasting memories around those things in the environment. So you've probably heard of this already. It's the most famous and the first described critical period is imprinting behavior in gray lag geese. So if you've ever seen those photographs of Konrad Lorenz being followed by little geese, that's because he discovered this first critical period where within 48 hours after hatching, those geese will form an attachment to whatever's moving around in their environment. But after that 48 hours is over, they won't form that attachment. And so since Konrad Lorenz discovered that in 1935, literally dozens of other critical periods have been described, everything from learning new languages to patterning the visual inputs in the brain, lots and lots of different critical periods. And we had discovered a new critical period for social reward learning. And this assay basically, I can go into the details of it, but basically it measures how much you learn from your peers. And so we think it models things like why teenagers, are so susceptible to peer pressure, why they will spend hours, making sure they're wearing the exact right shade of acid wash jeans in my day, right? And so they're really sensitive to their social environment. And after they get older, that goes away. And what we discovered is that if we give mice MDMA and then we wait for 48 hours without doing waiting for the drug to clear out of their system, then they will learn from their social environment as adults to the same degree that they learned when they were juveniles. And
even absent the 48 hours, continuously.
Yeah, continuously. So what we thought this was evidence of is that we were able to reopen this critical period. And why does that matter? Well, because basically, almost every neuropsychiatric disease, every neurological disease has a component of it that is learned. And we think that we're so terrible at curing the diseases of the brain because by the time we get around to intervening, the relevant critical period has already closed. And so neuroscientists for the last 100 years or so have been looking for so-called master keys for reopening critical periods. And meanwhile, clinicians are getting these incredible results without having any idea what the mechanism is. And we have this mechanism that we're like, if this is true, we should be able to cure all diseases of the brain and we should get these amazing clinical results. And so we realized that they were the same thing.
One thing I couldn't quite believe as I was trying to wrap my head around critical periods is that it's not just for behavior. People think there could be critical periods for things even like vision or sensory input. Could you explain exactly how that works?
Yeah. So, the broad explanation is that there aren't enough genes in the genome to encode every single thing that we need to survive in the world. Instead, what gets encoded is the ability to learn. So rather than encoding, let's say, one human language, what gets encoded is the possibility to learn any one of 7,000 possible languages. Similarly, the visual system, when you're born, your eyes are in a different location relative to each other, and as you get bigger and your head shape changes and you grow into your adult body, that relationship between the two eyes changes. And so as those neurons in the back of the eye and the retina are sending information to the brain, the relationships, the synaptic connections that encode things like depth perception have to be slightly altered. And so the brain stays in that plastic state until that visual information is stabilized. So the classic example of a visual critical period disease is that if you are born, let's say, with cataracts in both eyes, and you don't have those cataracts removed by the time you're, say, 5 or 6 years old, then you will be blind forever, even if they remove the cataracts, because that window of time when the visual system has to reorganize its circuitry to interpret that information coming through the eyes is over. And so even if you get rid of the physical impediment to that visual information, the brain can't interpret it. And so that is sort of a hard critical period that, is the kind of thing that, we can't fix without drugs to reopen them.
So in theory, you could take, at the most simplest level, MDMA might be able to help people see again.
Well, we are looking at that. You know, when I first started talking about this critical period idea of psychedelics, people were like, well, you know, that's just a soft critical period. It's just for emotions. It's just for feelings. It's not going to work for, you know, the hard critical periods like vision and motor learning. And so we are taking that challenge up, and we are looking at, my lab is really interested in the motor learning critical period, but I know that there are already 3 other labs after we published this first MDMA finding that have shown that ketamine and LSD are able to open the visual critical period in mice. So, you know, in theory, these are the master keys that we've been looking for.
Wow. Moving back into human patients, Ali, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the MAPS new drug application to the FDA last year, which, as I see you sighing, yes, it's a very big topic. But I guess just to start, could you help explain what were you studying and what were the results before we go to the drug application?
Sure. So MAPS did a number of clinical trials to study different indications, but primarily studied MDMA assisted therapy, MDMA with therapy for the treatment of moderate to severe PTSD. So the 2 phase 3 clinical trials, which make up the bulk of the NDA, the first one was patients who had severe PTSD, and then the second one was patients who had moderate to severe. Some other indications had been studied earlier on in phase 2, such as end-of-life anxiety and social anxiety in autistic adults, but this application was just for PTSD.
And what were the results?
Well, the results from phase 2 were very promising and published, showing that a very significant proportion of patients had a reduction in their PTSD symptoms, a clinically meaningful reduction. The numbers are something like 80 some percent, and that around 67% of people no longer had enough symptoms to qualify as having a diagnosis for PTSD on a very specific scale that's used to assess that in clinical trials. And I think it's important to give that caveat, because I think that some patients continue to feel like they have that diagnosis, regardless of whether they meet the scale for the studies.
86 sounds like a high number to me, but just for context, or Rachel, maybe you could help here too. How significant are these results?
I mean, they blow every other psychiatric drug out of the water. Like nowhere close. The effect size is much greater than the other approved medications for PTSD, which is why the FDA granted MAPS Lykos breakthrough therapy designation, which is to say that there is a disease, an indication that has a high unmet need, that there are no other treatments that are good at treating it. And I think it's also important to note that most of the patients in the studies had PTSD for a long time, on average like 14, 15 years, and had tried other approved medications, off-label medications, many different kinds of therapy. And so these were people who were suffering for a long time. Severe PTSD can be really debilitating, and people are not as functional as you would need for a clinical trial, and yet you had to find people who could do all the assessments and make all the visits. And so looking for a very special population of people who are suffering enough to be a part of the study, but are functional enough to actually participate.
One more thing I would just like to add about that. I mean, Lykos and MAPS got a little bit of criticism from the advisory committee and the FDA, because in looking for these patients, they made the decision to include patients who had had a prior use history with MDMA. And the criticism that was made was that, this patient population was contaminated. Some of these people, were enthusiasts for MDMA, and that is why this works so well. So it was like kind of one of their suggestions that this is how the cheating happened. But in my view, what this result shows really underscores an important feature of how this drug is working, and kind of brings us to the current moment of what the big debate is. And that is that notice it's not MDMA, here's a pill, you go home, you feel better. It's MDMA assisted therapy. The context matters, right? So you can't just take MDMA and go to a rave and expect to cure your PTSD. You really have to pair it with that right learning context. And so what that patient population that had previously taken MDMA in a recreational setting, even though they already had the diagnosis of PTSD, they still had PTSD after using MDMA in a recreational study, enough so that they qualified for these clinical trials. It was only when they had the MDMA plus the therapy that they got better. And so to my mind, those studies are actually the best evidence that we have. They're sort of within subject control data to show us that the therapy matters. And the reason that I'm, really underscoring this point is because, right now there are a lot of drug companies out there who are trying to develop novel patentable molecules that are derivatives of MDMA or other psychedelics. And they're trying to make the case that, we can democratize these drugs by getting rid of the trip, by getting rid of the need for therapy. We can turn them into next generation SSRIs. And in my view, this is unlikely to be true and is really just, falling into the trap of the old model of how we cure neuropsychiatric disease. For 50 years, people have been kind of dreaming about the biochemical imbalance model of neuropsychiatric disease. If you're depressed, it's just because you have a biochemical imbalance in serotonin. So we just rejigger it and then you'll be all better with just a pill. And I think what psychedelics and especially the Lykos trials have taught us is that no, that biochemical imbalance model maybe needs to be retired, and we need to really take seriously this learning model, which says that what psychedelics are doing is they're opening up that window, that critical period state of susceptibility, vulnerability, learning that enables the therapy to actually work.
Yeah, I think it's worth stepping back to say, so in our clinical trials, people get MDMA sessions 3 times. Total. And there's therapy before the sessions, therapy during the sessions, and therapy in between the sessions. In fact, in a about 12-week period, people had 42 hours of therapy. So when you think about how people are normally doing therapy, like once a week for 50 minutes, because that's what insurance covers, if you're lucky, if your insurance covers it, this is a significantly higher dose of therapy than what is standard for talk therapy.
I'm glad that you bring up this 1-2 approach, and I do want to point out one thing that I've seen is actually potentially a liability of this approach. The FDA specifically mentioning that they're not entirely sure how to regulate a therapy. It's not something the FDA typically does. But also, in the most extreme example, which has gotten a lot of press, an instance where there was an instance of sexual misconduct between a therapist or 2 therapists and a patient. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I spoke to it at the advisory committee panel as well. I mean, ethical violations like that are never okay. There's no excuse. And it is, malpractice and inappropriate, to say the least. So what happened in the context of one participant in a phase 2 study, I was not involved in that. That study happened before I joined MAPS Lykos, but I know that MAPS and Lykos, once they found out about it, tried to certainly distance themselves appropriately and coordinated efforts to make sure that the person who had perpetrated this got appropriate oversight of that, but also to take care of the person as best they knew how to at the time, and And then there were changes that were made within the company's clinical trials about, some had already been made because we found out about it years after it had happened. But the changes that were made were to make sure that there was more oversight, that there was licensure of both people in the room, so there was more accountability. The person who was the perpetrator was unlicensed in that case. And to develop a code of ethics that goes beyond people's individual licensure ethics around what is appropriate and not appropriate in psychedelic sessions. It was taken very seriously, but it's a horrific thing that happened, and it should not have happened.
And I guess even more broadly, I'm wondering, is what could potentially make this therapeutic approach so beneficial, right, to have this increased malleability, this increased openness, does that not also come with risks? I mean, systemically built into the practice itself. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that criticism?
Potentially. I mean, I think it's something that's important to study and keep track of and have mechanisms for people to be for accountability and safeguards in place. Unfortunately, these kinds of things happen in non-psychedelic psychotherapy and other power dynamic situations. And so we don't know if it's more than would be in other kinds of care and therapy. There are reasons you could think that would be because of what Gul's talking about, of the kind of closeness that you feel with people while you're under the influence. But the therapists are not taking MDMA. The therapists should be following their licensure and their ethics. And so they should be setting appropriate boundaries. And that, whether it's a psychedelic trial or psychedelic care or other kinds of therapy or medical care, that should be very clear.
But then I would just add that, outside of the clinical setting, the mechanistic insight that we are having suggests that, they're sort of neutral, right, in terms of what the experience is like. If you think about, how psychedelics in the 60s were used, whether or not you had a good trip or a bad trip had a lot to do with the context, which they were calling, mindset and situational setting. And if you're in this sort of vulnerable state that's similar to the vulnerable state that you were in as a child, right, then, that certainly explains why someone like Charles Manson can give LSD to some hippies every day, indoctrinate them into his cult, and then get them to, murder celebrities in order to save the world through helter skelter, right? So this kind of brainwashing is also possible under these sort of heightened states of susceptibility and vulnerability and learning, right? So we do need to be careful, and understanding this mechanism, I think, really underscores how we need to be approaching this from an ethical point of view. And when we are, and the other part of our studies that I haven't really talked about is that the duration of the open state that we measure after the acute effects of the drugs have worn off is actually surprisingly long. So it's proportional to how long the trip lasts. So for drugs like ketamine, where the trip is short, like 30 minutes to 2 hours, then the open state of the critical period is about 48 hours. By 4 days, it's coming down. For MDMA and psilocybin, it's longer. It's at least 2 weeks. And then for LSD, it's even longer, 3 weeks. And ibogaine, which is this extremely long trip lasting from 36 to 72 hours, then the critical period stays open for like a month after, probably more. And so what this tells us in terms of how we're thinking about clinical trials is that, we spend a lot of time focusing on patient safety during the trip and preparing them so that they have a safe trip. But I think that this mechanistic insight is telling us that we also need to be thinking about what's happening to the patients in the 2 to 3 weeks after the trip. And, the MAPS trials, and the handbook for how to do this therapy, they emphasize the importance of that integration period. But I would argue, it's a little bit of a missed opportunity if we aren't continuing the therapy and the intensive learning for that whole 2 weeks right after the trip is over, but also it's a time that we need to make sure we're not sending patients home back to their traumatizer or putting them in difficult situations where they're not able to really integrate or they're possibly getting further injury.
I just want to add, what we've just been talking about also to me underscores the importance of actually legalizing and regulating this therapy, because an increasing number of people are seeking it out underground. People are going to continue to do that because they're in need of healing. And as long as people are doing it underground, they're having to go to, who knows? It could be your neighbor. It could be some unlicensed predator. There's no regulation whatsoever. It's left up to them to figure out, how do I get this? Who do I go to? I interviewed a guy who, the person he found underground, she was a licensed therapist, but she accidentally gave him methamphetamine. So until this is legalized and regulated, it's going to be even more harmful, more unsafe.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Can we get one more round of applause for the panel?
Everybody's free to feel good.
That's another hour of Radio Pacific. Our show is edited by Ben Trefny, with sound design by Kirk Pearson and Dogbotic Studios. Thank you so much to Lori Tipton for sharing her experience with MDMA therapy. Thank you again to all of our panelists, Gul Dolan, Aaliyah Lilienstein, and Rachel Newer. And huge thank you as well to Deb Harlow, Jennifer Mitchell, Maria Mangini, and Charles Lighthouse. And of course, thank you for listening. I'm Eli Cohen. This is Radio Pacific.
Brother and sister, together we'll make it through.